Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to EIG's fifth in a series of webinars, which features our partners scmBLOX, Chris White, and the Supply Chain Risk Management Consortium's Greg Schlegel. I'm Jim Vries from Enhance International Group. We're focusing today on finding the apex of alternatives for your dependencies on rare earth minerals, transforming risk events into opportunities for revenue growth. This is part two of our series. We'll pick up from where we left off last month. We appreciate you taking the time to join us and building your evolving resilient enterprise. And we look forward to providing you insights to making decisions for your executive level. Most importantly, we hope that your family are healthy and safe. A lot of events happening recently. Please do take care of yourself. Again, this is the fifth of the series of webinars, and we're focusing on those rare earths and looking how do we capitalize on risk, meaning when risks happen, is there a possibility of finding revenue growth opportunities, and what would that look like, and how would that be handled? So that's going to be a very interesting discussion. So with that, we're going to get into the deliverables. The deliverables today are first, we're going to gain insights on how insights into finding the apex of alternatives. So what is that top solution to the alternatives on dependencies and how rare earth materials can affect your supply chain? We're going to discover advanced techniques in strategic simulation modeling to safeguard your supply chain with Chris. He'll go through his first-of-a-kind modeling software, and then we'll get into the actionable strategies to gain practical advice on how to enhance your company's resilience and maintain uninterrupted product delivery and gain your unfair market share, I like to say. With that, we are trying to transform these events into opportunities for revenue growth, like I just mentioned. So with that, Greg will kick us off with his Supply Chain Risk Management Consortium. Greg.
You bet. Thanks a lot, Jim. Great to be here with you all to chat about this critical aspect of supply chain and risk. This is who we are and what we do. On the right side of the screen, we have three pillars. Actually, we're 32 companies, 1,700 risk pros around the world. We operate in 23 countries as well. Actually, we haven't had time to put yes, they are. As there's Chris's logo. Chris White is a new member of our team, and so welcome aboard, Chris. Wanted to make sure that we got you in there under software as a service. So woohoo! We have we have three pillars. We have education. We do a lot of education. I'm on my way to Dubai in a day or two to do a 5-day public session on supply chain risk and resiliency. We do a lot of consulting as well, where we lead, guide, direct, and coach. And then, as you see on the right-hand side, we have a host of software as a service solutions to do a lot of heavy lifting, all right, in terms of supply chain risk and resiliency. On the left-hand side, we have like 5 product lines. We have 2 online education courses where you can receive certificates from the Supply Chain Risk Management Consortium. One is basic supply chain risk and resiliency. The other is geared almost exclusively to public health care. We have 2 online assessments. One is supply chain management readiness assessment, which evaluates your process maturity and your risk. The other brand new is what we call Supply Chain Risk and Resiliency 90-Day Action Plan. That uses AI/ML algorithms to identify through questions of discovery what your risk maturity is as an organization, your risk appetite, and your risk culture, and then provides action plans within that arena. Again, we do a lot of coaching where we lead, guide, direct, and coach, and then we have solutions as well. Our job is to identify, assess, mitigate, and manage supply chain risks. I'll turn it over to Chris.
Hey, perfect. Thanks, Greg. And thanks for adding scmBLOX there. And scmBLOX is a supply chain structural simulation tool designed for long-term strategic what-if scenario analysis. And the foundation for scmBLOX has actually been around for quite a while. We've been did a lot of work for the military, the Air Force, and the Army. And in the blocks family, we've actually got several different tools ranging from supply chain to project management to biodiversity to asset management. So a lot of tools in there, all based on dozens of projects doing R&D type research and development type work. And so now what we're trying to do is actually commercialize. And here we've got scmBLOX, the supply chain stimulation tool that we're commercializing.
Thanks,
Thanks, Jim. And
Chris. Great company, great story since 2000. Thank you so much. And just to give you a little background on Enhance International Group, we're a group of over 60 partners working together to do the 1+1 = 3 for you to deliver self-sustaining growth and gain and maintain your competitive edge. From our perspective today, we're always trying to link strategy and execution with our partners. Some of our partners focus more on strategy, some more on execution, and some are crossing across both of those from a supply chain risk and resiliency perspective, and that's what we're doing today. Chris provides that strategic look at your supply chain, and then Greg offers a lot of the execution pieces in how do you make your supply chain more resilient. With that, we're going to go ahead and get started. And what the agenda is today is we're going to focus on rare earth mineral challenges that are out there in the industry today. We want to just set the stage. Then Chris is going to go through the structural simulation modeling example of what would it be like in your second, third tier if you lose a supplier, and he'll go through that modeling example and what are the ramifications to your P&L. Then Greg will get into some case studies of what's happening out there today in 3 rare earth areas. And then we'll get into how do you address this? What are our recommendations and what have we seen as best practices on how to address the rare earth raw material constraints that are out there for all of us. And then we'll just wrap it up a little bit on how to get started with some financials. So again, we'll get started with some of the rare earth mineral challenges out there. When you really look at it, you talk about rare earths, but we're talking about rare materials and rare materials into the U.S. defense assets. And so we decided to focus a little bit about the U.S.'s military dependency on Chinese chips, Chinese manufactured chips, that is. And so on the left, you have the Navy's newest aircraft carrier is powered by 6,500 Chinese manufactured chips. The Navy's newest F-18 Super Hornets fly with 5,000 Chinese chips. And then we get into the B-2, the Minuteman ICBM, the Ohio-class submarines, and the Patriot missiles. The DLA, the Department of Logistics Agency, which is the largest procurement company, quote, quote, at least in the United States, if not the world, shows how they are sourcing these chips from Chinese manufacturers. And so it doesn't even end there. You can keep going and you can identify even more of the U.S. manufactured. All our defense is manufactured and assembled in the U.S., but a lot of the sourcing comes from overseas in China making these chips. We actually helped them set up those chip manufacturing when the chip manufacturing moved from primarily in South Korea, well, originally Japan, then Taiwan, then South Korea, and now China. So maybe it comes back to the U.S. eventually. We'll see. With that, we want to talk about what are the risks to the U.S. military, the risks and the supply chain vulnerabilities that are out there. We have geopolitical risk, lack of control and reliability, technological and industrial lag, cybersecurity risks. We worry that the chips being manufactured, that are they clean, so to speak, for us. And so we ask ourselves, how do we
Mhm.
deal with these risks? And some of the things that are being done out there include diversity, looking for other manufacturers, go vertical, meaning things like start making the chips in the US from a domestic perspective or on friendly countries to the US. Uh, the raw materials that go into the chips are really being controlled by China today. How do we go vertical and invest in recycling of rare earths? Can we bring some of that in? What are the substitution for critical elements, which we'll get into a little bit in this webinar, and reducing the reliance on a single source suppliers. And of course, again, friendly countries fostering partnerships with allies. Allies is certainly an area that is being looked upon. With that, I will turn it over to Greg.
You bet. Thanks a lot, Jim. Thought we'd share a few more salient statistics with you concerning the rare earth metals. What you see is China produces 98% of the world's gallium. You may not be familiar with that, and 68% of the world's germanium. And so the blue chart, the chart with the blue graph, is basically the imports. They depict the imports of those two rare earth minerals for other countries. So pretty dependent on gallium and germanium and where it comes from. So the net is China has recently put on an export restriction. That's why we're talking about this. There are some risks. Over on the left, we say, well, the long-term supply contracts are potentially impossible now to obtain because approval takes anywhere from 30 to 80 days, back and forth. And the situation we hear might be even exacerbated by accusations of Chinese stockpiling, in terms of the raw material to prove a point and or improve the price. And then finally, on the right-hand side, why are we talking about these? Jim mentioned the impact to the Western warfighting agencies, but these go into applications. You can take a look: fiber optics, night vision, goggles, chips, 5G, you name it, electronically, and including chemicals. It's kind of important. All right, that's why we're chatting about it. So we'll move on and talk a little bit more in generalities associated with leveraging supply chain risk and resiliency to garner market share and revenue. Kind of the basic premise of our discussion today. This is a graphic story of a risk event detection and a potential response. So let me describe the chart. On the y-axis on the left is the value of your organization, street value, whether you're private or public, from low to high. On the x-axis is elapsed time from 0 to infinity. All right. So let's say that you have a risk event. Let's say it starts right here at the level of the value of your organization on the street. And so we ask you at that time 0, all right, which path would you want your company to follow in terms of responding to a risk event, no matter what it is? Let's take a look at this one, the red line. All right, this is basically late detection, meaning it takes you longer as a company to detect that there is a risk to your company. And then there's always a delayed response after that as well. That's the red line. Would you want your company to go through the path of the yellow line, which is, again, a delayed response, but a little quicker in terms of responding than the red line? Or would you want your company to travel the path of the green line, which is early detection and a rapid response to the risk event, including as you see on the right-hand side, when you recover, that green line is actually higher than the value of your organization at the start of the risk event. How could that happen? Well, that is indicative of you and your organization being more, better prepared and more responsive to that risk event than your nearest competitor, and therefore you will garner new market share from your competitors, especially if your product is homogeneous, meaning it's same as but different in terms of your competitors. So they're going to call you there if you have capacity, if you have the ability to respond quicker, you can and will garner market share from your competitors, and you will probably keep it as they come back online. How do you do that? Well, you do have to go through some education and some awareness. You have to understand and learn how to reduce the time and duration of the event, because a risk event is time and time is money. You have to learn how to reduce the severity and slope of those lines to mitigate the risk to your value of the organization. And you need to learn how to accelerate the tools and techniques to accelerate the time to recovery, which is on the right-hand side. With that, I'll turn it over to Jim.
Thanks, Greg. And we're going to start a polling question next. And what countries do raw materials come from now for your business? So we'll ask you to type where you're getting those rare earth materials. So go ahead and start entering in where those what the source of those countries are, and when we end this section, we will re-engage here. And I think we have a question in here in the chat. Can you give an example of not detecting an event that happened? Great.
Good question. Not detecting. Well, those are called black swans initially. All right. One, you're not projecting, or you have no awareness of what happens. We can't say a strike, because a strike, most of us understand a strike, a group, a union's contract. So strikes are not really black swans, but black swan events would be basically something like the statement from China, a tariff, a tax, or a constraint on exports. All right, because that comes out of the blue. That is pretty much a black swan, even if you're attentive. And it's once you witness that risk event or that statement of condition, then away you go. I'm trying to think of some real live situations where companies didn't really detect a risk. I would say, to answer the question, maybe competition, that is a risk. And if especially in like the iPhones, the phone arena, telecom, if you're not attentive to what your competitor is doing in that business, you're not aware of when they're going to launch something new, that would be my opinion of a risk that is undetected. You weren't watching the store, you didn't have intelligence, and boom, they come out with a product launch, and it's way above the capability of your product existing, and now you have to chase. That's my best first blush reaction. Sorry for the lengthy answer.
That's all right. It's a tough question that he posed because a lot of these things are unseen, and when it happens, they don't like to talk about it. So that's the problem. And companies aren't really willing to share that kind of news publicly on a
That's
regular
true.
basis.
Yep.
So, but it happens every day, especially in the cyber world, right, Greg? that
Oh
type of.
yeah, yeah, threats every day. Sure.
They have threats every day. So in the cyber world,
Every
this
day.
is happening every day.
Hmm.
So with that, we'll come back to this. Please, if you have a China or Australia or is a country that you know that your raw materials are coming from, just type it in again, and then we'll just see it come out a little bit stronger. With that, we'll get into the structural modeling with Chris. Chris, take it away.
Definitely. So what we're doing right here, when we talk about sort of strategic what if scenario simulation, this we're kind of at this Venn diagram nexus of having a strategic, tactical, operational perspective with these supply chain readiness assessments. The strategic, we've in one of our earlier webinars talked about the strategic risk paradox, where we don't spend a lot of time and energy on looking at strategic risks that have a huge impact on the company. Instead, we spend most of our time and attention in the operational world with tools and software there that really that doesn't have a big impact as big as some of these strategic ones. So we're trying to take that strategic focus. And then we're bringing in a structural simulation that doesn't really require a lot of data to get started. It's more relationship, cause and effect oriented. So that's kind of where we're sitting, is right there. And that little nexus helps address a lot of the VUCA world that we hear about, and it helps us to understand how risks from a strategic standpoint come into play on our operations and impact your company. And so that's what we're going to take a look at. And what we've done, this is our first slide that kind of gets you back. We've built this over 4 previous webinars, and we're just using the exact same models we've used before, just so everyone is clear. It's a very simple, you receive material. I'm looking at the image at the bottom. You receive material, you got a stockpile of raw materials that then go into production, are then finished goods, and that becomes the source of deliveries. And we always try to hold 4 weeks of raw materials and 4 weeks of finished goods. And the flow through this whole thing is 100 orders a week, and it's a 2-year simulation. The scope is that this is one product line or one SKU for a company. So when we show that something horrible happens, it doesn't mean the company necessarily goes out of business. It means they have trouble with this. We've got everything set so that the control feedback loops for regaining inventory are we'll call it moderate. They're not slow, but they're not super fast either. And again, trying to always have 4 weeks of inventory. And so that typically, if there's 100 coming through, that means 400 in raw material and 400 in finished goods. So now what we're going to do, I'm going to go back. This is what we used in webinar 4, the previous webinar. We built the complexity of this example. And now what we've got, the basis of last webinar and this webinar, is that we've got 3 industries that share the same critical raw material supplier down at tier 3. Now that is not a single supplier. That actually, one of the things with the scmBLOX and some of this structural simulation is the level of detail. That is a cluster of companies in, say, China or Africa or wherever, that are kind of a regional cluster that have a capacity altogether. And but then the others are companies. And so we've got tier 3 that everyone shares these industries. We've got defense, EV, and electronics. We are this light blue OEM that's on the defense side. So we care very much in the defense industry of making sure that we are delivering so that the warfighter has what they need. But this is the structure that we're going to use. Now, what we're going to impose on this structure right here, is that the electronics industry triples their order at some point in time. And what we did in the last webinar was we looked at how that tripling of orders comes through, and like a spider web, we eventually get impacted over at the sitting over here on the defense industry side with OEM number 1. Again, that's our focus. Every chart you see will be for this one. So what we decided in again, we're going to kind of recap. So we didn't like the effects of that, and so we ran a scenario where, well, what if we developed a new product, either substitution or sort of configuring that product to where it doesn't need as much of that critical raw material. And so let's say it took us 10 months to reduce that by 50%. So what we're showing in the diagram here is that we've got a new supplier that's going to come on and supply this more common material, and we only need 50% now going to this critical raw material third tier cluster or whatever. So you see that 50-50 split at month 11. So month 1 is when the tripling occurs, and 10 months later, month 11, we get this benefit. So that's scenario 2 from last time. Then scenario 3 was that same thing. We actually liked what we saw with scenario 2. So scenario 3, we said, well, what if we worked a little bit longer on that new product and we're able to remove our dependency even more, up to 80%. So now it's a 12-month new product development process, and we're going to remove 80%. So now our chart looks like this, where at month 13, 80% is going to go over to this new supplier of something more common, and then 20% goes to our critical material supplier. So now when we looked at the results, and again, this is all from webinar 4, but we're just doing this to frame it because we're going to go somewhere from this. We had our baseline, same baseline we've always had, making basically $120,000. Longest lead time is a week. We deliver everything. Our minimum profit margin is 20%. We don't have any spikes. Everything's nice and smooth. Scenario 1 with the tripling, we suddenly had a lot of problems, and we're going to look at a couple of charts here just to refresh our memory. Then scenario 2, where we came in and introduced a new product after 10 months that had reduced our reliance on that critical material by 50%. That had some benefits. And in fact, we didn't miss any deliveries at all with that. We had a couple of oscillations in inventory, but we actually did well when it came to delivery. And then scenario 3, where we waited a little bit longer, we actually still had we suffered a little bit, not as bad as scenario 1, but we suffered a little bit because we waited too long and we didn't beat the time span, which you'll see in the next chart here. That where we are looking, this is now deliveries, and our baseline is that flat line, 100. We're always delivering it. And scenario 2 actually does the same, but you'll see that scenario 3 is that dotted blue line. Sorry, let's start with scenario 1, the dashed red line. That was the worst. That's where we did not do anything, and it took a year for it. Now, remember, month 1 is when this happened, so it's a year later that we're seeing this impact make its way through the supply chain. And like we talked about last time, if this was the real world, when that happened after a year, that the CEO of that defense company would have been fired saying, oh, this is crazy, you can't do anything. Well, this was all that ripple effect coming through. And then scenario 3, scenario 2, again, was a good one, and we were able to deliver everything. And scenario 3 is not quite as bad as scenario 1, but you'll see they dip the same at the beginning because we didn't miss that delay that was happening. So if we look at the finances of those, again, looking at kind of the funds available, we sort of rank them like this, where your baseline was the best, scenario 2 comes in next, so that's that 50% solution, and then scenario 3, and then not doing anything is kind of the worst. So what we want to do in this webinar is build on that concept of creating a new product or a new version that has less reliance on this critical material. And we use two cases, the 50% case and the 80% case. But we thought, well, let's kind of see if there's a strategic optimum that says, if we get something out faster, even though it's not doesn't decrease our reliance as much, but we get it out faster, does that help us? Or is it better to wait even longer and get rid of 100% of that? So we're going to look at a few scenarios here. So here's one of them, scenario 4. So we're going to go a little bit faster. It only takes 8 months in scenario 4, but we only get 35%. So this is that same chart we were showing. And we're going to put all this in a table in a second to make it easier to kind of visualize and understand. But this is scenario 4. We're going to call it the 35%. Scenario 5 then is where we're going to do something even shorter, but we're only going to get 25% reduction of that raw material. So those are looking kind of faster and less. And then we want to look at one other scenario, scenario 6, where we say, what if we took 14 months, took longer, and got rid of 100% reliance and completely got rid of that raw material? Now, of course, that may be the long-term goal, but we're looking at this 2-year simulation and kind of comparing over this time frame. What we did was put them in a chart now so you can see all these scenarios. And don't worry so much about the number of scenarios, but just look, we basically created this curve that says, you can get something out fast and not have and reduce it by just a little bit. And as it gets longer, you kind of get this little bit of a curve. It's not a linear. You're kind of buying yourself more every 2 months that you wait. And in the table over here on the left is perhaps a better view. In 6 months, you've reduced the critical material by 25%. 8 months, it's 35%. 10 months, it's 50%. That's the one we looked at, scenario 2. 12 months, it's 80%. That's scenario 3. And then here's a new one. What if we went 14 months and got rid of everything? So these are now, the numbering of the scenarios is kind of weird, but this is sort of the curve that we're looking at. So now if we take a look at those results, this is now the finished goods inventory. And we have this table on here to remind you which ones are which. But interesting, so we already knew that scenario 2, that's the black line there, did fairly well. Well, it turns out that scenarios 4 and 5, we don't have any dip in inventory at all. And then we know that we had seen previously the scenario 3, and so we see that dip. And then scenario 6, when we wait longer, even longer, we actually end up a little bit worse than scenario 6. So when it comes to finished goods, scenarios 2, 4, and 5 end up being good. Those shorter ones tend to be better. And if we now look at the deliveries, of course, finished goods is going to impact deliveries, because if I don't have finished goods, I can't deliver. So now we see scenarios 2, 4, and 5 again look great. They're just flat. There's no impact on deliveries. And we've got scenario 3, which we had seen before. And then scenario 6, remember, that's the longer one. We're going to get rid of 100%, but we didn't quite beat that tsunami heading our way with that one. So what's interesting, we can then let's look at the finances, but we sort of have these ranked. They all kind of end up stacking on top of each other a little bit. But again, the scenario 4 ends up being slightly better than the others. And we're talking just a little bit, but you can see that scenario 4, that's that dashed red line, is also more consistent, which is nice. Any of these others have a little bit of oscillation to them in terms of money. So you're making a little more at times and making less, and things like that. So if we now put this in a table like we've looked at before, the scenario 2 and 3 we had before. Now we've got scenario 4, which actually looks really, really good. Again, no impact to deliveries. We don't have a lot of spikes in finished goods or anything like that. Our delivery time stayed at 1 week. We were able to deliver everything. And our minimum profit margin was actually something positive. So we only went down to 18%. So remember, 20% is what the baseline is. So we barely dipped below that. So pretty good. Scenario 5, shorter but less. We see some similar results, but we have some more oscillations in raw material, and that ends up causing some of our profit margin to dip. And then scenario 6, if we wait a much longer time and get rid of 100%, we actually end up having a pretty bad situation where we're suffering because we didn't beat that tsunami, and we were hit by that, and we have a long lead time of 14 weeks at some point in the simulation. But I want to put these in a chart now.
To sum it up, the longer you wait, the bigger the pain that you're going to receive, right?
Actually, there ends up being this, I'll call it a strategic optimal that we've laid out right here. And that was that scenario 4 that says, if you could do something in 8 months and get rid of 35%, that's kind of best. Anything shorter than that is not enough to change the offset that you're going to have. And if you wait even longer, like you were just saying, Jim, it's not soon enough to offset. So one of them's not doing enough. One of them's not soon enough. So sort of strategically, we've got this nice one, scenario 4, that says, if we can do something in 8 months to get rid of 35%, we kind of beat the tsunami, this big wave that's coming our way. We beat that and do it with minimal impact. So what's interesting in that case, let's take scenario 4, but like Jim and Greg were saying earlier, you'd actually get a little bit of competitive advantage there. If you were actually unimpacted, then you could gain some of the market share from some of the other companies. So we have a scenario 7 that now lays out the same as scenario 4, but we're going to say you get an additional 20% of demand. You're going to steal that from your competitors over the over that 6 months of once you introduce that product, because now you're beating everybody, you're delivering, and other folks, your competitors are not. So we're going to see that plus 20%.
And you will
So,
see, just as an example, but in the real world, you'll see the top 10 companies in the world do this all the time. This is
yeah,
not new, but this is how
right.
companies slowly eat away at their competitors over time. Apple does it. You see all those top 50 companies understand this and are doing this every day.
Absolutely. Great comment. And that's why this is not really a far-fetched, oh, let's just pretend you got 20%. No, this is a realistic expectation. So now when we factor that in, our new table, when we add our scenario 7 in there, we see some other things happening. So the light green on the left are the scenarios 2 and 3 that we had before. We've highlighted that scenario 4 is the one that we like. And now we've added this scenario 7 in the table that says, okay, we would actually get this additional 20%. And so we would see some oscillations simply because we're gaining and we're having to expand capacity. And so there's some of this sort of juggling going on, but we made some more money, and as far as deliveries, we weren't impacted. Our longest lead time was not impacted, still just a week. We made all our deliveries. Our net profit margin did dip to 8%, so not negative like the others. But because of these oscillations and offsetting of raw materials and production capacity and things like that, we do dip, but still end up making some more money. So now what we want to look at, these are now the deliveries, and we've added scenario 7, which is the thicker green line. So same chart we've seen before, except now scenario 7, you see that we're able to bump up and end up doing 20% more deliveries over time. And if we look at, sorry, that's finished goods. Our finished goods, this is deliveries, rise over time. Sorry about that. If we take a look at the next one, we are looking at the funds available. And again, they get kind of close to each other. So we've zoomed in on that. So we've got a zoomed in version that allows you to see the oscillations a little bit better, because these kind of, the first half of it's just a straight line. So we zoom in on that second half and see some of these oscillations and these bigger differences in the funds available as they play out in that back half of the simulation. And if we then look at the profit margin, like we've done with some of the other ones, so there's the zoomed in version where we see that the end of those. And then if we look at the profit margin, again, we've got these oscillations because when we have excess raw material at some point in time. Once that raw material and finished goods starts fluctuating, then we begin to see these profit margins change as well. And again, scenario 4 and 7 tend to look pretty good. But if you look at that thick green line, you do have some oscillations, and that can sometimes, from a profit margin standpoint, look bad. But what really matters is how long did it take us to get back to the profit margin in terms of dollars, not our percentage profit margin, but our profit margin in terms of dollars. How quickly can we return to that? So our final chart sort of shows this, like I said, a strategic optimum that says, hey, if scenario 7 ends up working, scenario 4 is the one you want to go with. And when you do scenario 4, you gain 20%. We're assuming 20% market share. And so now when you add that 20%, even though we see dips in the profit margin for scenario 7, it actually got us, it was the quickest time to recover to our original margin when you start looking in terms of weeks and things like that. And so it actually only took us 85 weeks to get back to the margin, where some of the other ones took a lot longer, 95, and some even as long, like that scenario 6, where we're trying to do 100%. That one takes 175 weeks to finally. So we allowed the simulation to run past 2 years to see how long would it take all that to kind of settle down. And so anyway, in this, it very much points back to Greg's chart on slide 14 that said, if you can react to those risks more quickly, you have the chance to have a value in the end that's higher than what you started with initially. So it's a very interesting chart when you see this last chart that's got the optimum kind of, you can see the bend in the curve, and where scenario 7, 4, and 7 are kind of together, but scenario 7 is that best one. You can see that. So
Yeah, just a
yeah,
quick
very
comment
interesting.
here. As a former controller and in talking to CFOs through these types of events, you know, you're typically when these events happen, if you're not proactive, you're seeing these large oscillations. And what happens is the COO is sitting there saying he's got to act or she's got to act, and they generally oversteer or understeer and make it worse
Mm-hmm.
because they don't understand the impact. By having this stimulation model, it can really help the executive team know what's happening, what can happen, and so
Mm-hmm.
that they understand that the oscillations are going to occur, and there will be
Yeah.
a valley, a dip, and a rise, up and down from month to month, throughout quarter to quarter. It may not even settle out within a quarter, especially if you do your more delayed actions. So this can really help make sure that executive team makes prudent decisions through these
Yeah.
times, no matter what you end up choosing to do. I think that's the
That's
real
a
power of this
yeah.
simulation model.
That's a great comment, Jim. We can sometimes in our reactions make the situation worse. In our attempt to make it better, we actually exasperate the problem. So yeah, great comment. But yeah, this has been a very interesting exercise, and again, kind of showing on this chart right here that scenario 7 sort of gives you the best situation, and so you want in this example, there's benefit to coming out with a new product that reduces your new version of your product that reduces your dependency on that critical raw material by some significant chunk quickly, but you don't benefit by getting a little bit too early, and you don't benefit by getting a lot of it later. And so there's kind of this optimal point, and then you're going to gain some competitive advantage, which pushes you even more to the increase in value.
Yeah, I think just looking at this, being able to reduce that time to recovery down to 85 weeks, the shorter this time to recovery is, like Chris said,
Yeah.
the higher your margin, you're just going to recover much faster. So what you see is it may be counterintuitive that you actually want to ramp up when there is an incident occurring in the industry, and you want to position yourself to be able to gain that quote quote unfair market share of stealing it
Yeah.
away from your competitors. I love
Yeah. This has been a fun
it.
exercise.
It shows
Yeah.
it shows what we've been talking about for years in a very excellent study by Chris and his model. So it's very sometimes difficult to convince executives that this actually occurs, but now we can, and we can
Yeah.
run your scenario for your company and what you would like to see, and understand that the faster you respond, the lower the valley of despair that your company will go into, right?
Yeah, to a point. I mean, that's what's interesting because you can do a little bit too early or a
Yeah,
lot too late. There ends up being kind of this
yeah,
nice, again, I'll say strategic optimal solution. And so, yeah, it's real interesting to go through this. That's been
yeah. And I
been
think
fun.
Mark and mentioned, the quality during these times is very suspect. You generally have more waste because you're trying to make up, you're trying to push your production to higher production, higher
Mm-hmm.
levels of output, and your waste may go up if you don't have an overall plan of exactly how you're going to do this in a concerted manner.
Yeah,
So I think that was a great point Mark made in the
yeah.
chat. Thanks, Mark.
Mhm.
With that, We didn't get many countries past Indonesia, China, Australia, Venezuela. Greg, I know you have some thoughts here. What countries come to your mind besides these?
It's a good point. I mean, those are the big guys, all right. But essentially, any. It's interesting. Any country offshore, meaning you hear about everyone talking about friendly shoring, near shoring, uh, anything that has a long lead time item, especially in a country that may or may not be friendly to your particular manufacturing country and or it goes on and on. So I'm not surprised. Again, most of our discussion of rare earth, we know where it comes from. And Australia is probably the second largest country in terms of rare earth. Folks, the US, being parochial, we have a lot of these raw earth materials. We just have policies and procedures that have stopped mining them. Just a comment.
Yeah, we have it. And of course, Africa has a lot of
That's
untapped,
what I was going to say.
and
I'm surprised
there's
we
too
didn't
many
see
countries to
Utah.
name in Africa. Otherwise, I'd just
True,
fill it up
that's a
with
good one.
African
Yep,
countries here too.
I agree. Yep.
Yeah,
Yeah.
like
And
Congo. Yeah.
there's other countries in South America. And of course, the US has a lot of untapped. And I think when we say go vertical, that's saying go vertical within the US and uh, the new friendly countries, so to speak, that we can do business with. But keep in mind, Africa has been, really uh, I don't know how you say it, but a lot of investment by China in Africa and South America in these areas. So they are going, China's not, they're also don't want to dig in their own backyard. So they have set up companies, ports, they're building ports in these countries so that they can mine the those countries minerals in South America and Africa and so forth. So it's it's not uh it's not for I think we all are doing it not in our own backyard.
Yeah.
And I think it's things are going to be changing, but they own the biggest market, the largest population, so they control the price. That's the bottom line. I don't know how we get out of that. Mark mentioned Martin Pass in the US is providing something like 14% of the US demand, and they're not hamstrung by regulations. Thanks, Mark. For that, we're going to move on to some case studies by Greg.
You bet. Thanks a lot, Jim. Good discussion. Very interesting cause and effect in terms of the modeling from Chris. We said we'd talk about 3 case studies just to give you some highlights and maybe do a deep dive on one of them. First, we have helium gas. It is used in many critical applications: rockets, MRI scanners, fiber optics, electronics, you name it. All right. Demand is expected to grow to double by 2035 due to the semiconductor market and so forth. What's helium? It's hard to collect. It's out there. It's free. All right. But it's hard to collect profitably. And actually, the US government has made a statement it will no longer sell helium. They capture it. They're not going to sell it to traders. Why? Because the US government finally figured out that it's critically important to our industries and our warfighting agencies. Another one, gallium and germanium. We talked about that. That's kind of the perfect storm. We talked about geopolitical tensions. It's a choke point. We see it as a choke point right now, potentially to the warfighting agencies, especially in the US. And then finally, we have the electronic chip conundrum. We've been wrestling with that for 3, 4, 5 years. Jim gave us a wake-up call from the US military in terms of some of our key weapon systems. And so we'll do a deep dive on the chip conundrum for you in a second. Jim showed you the picture from the merge article. Again, if you look at that graph on the right side of the slide and go left to right, those are just 4 US weapon systems. Then Jim mentioned our Defense Logistics Agency has all of its supplier base who handle the componentries and so forth. And then finally, on the right-hand side, those are the present raw material country of origin. That's our concern. How'd this happen? Well, overall, the U.S. Defense Weapons System study found that 41% of all the systems rely on Chinese chips. That's ominous. All right. We used to produce 40% on our own here. Now it's 10%. And also, all chip production relies on high quality neon gas. Guess where that gas comes from? Ukraine. And Ukraine has supplied the US with over 90% of our requirements historically. So, what does it mean to us? Well, we see it as a lack of strategic supply chain planning and thinking. The US and the Department of Defense over the last 10 years have been focusing on tactical and operational excellence. That's all good. All right. The net is we now have potential choke points for all the Western warfighting agencies. So where do we go? We talked a little bit about some possible solutions. You got to start designing and incentivizing capital investments here in the US. You got to start developing maybe some talented technological workforce so that we can build these products, mine them and build them and apply them, an industrial infrastructure, supply chain visibility, and favorable, as Mark mentioned, favorable regulatory environments, because they have not been very friendly in the US. And so there we have it. All these segments are potentially, or all these approaches potentially will help us mitigate this strategic risk for all of us. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jim.
Thanks, Greg. A lot to take in. So what are some of the recommendations on how to address rare earth raw material constraints? First, we want to understand who else is using these raw materials. We want to continually look at new ways to build products by looking at the supply chain, design for supply chain. So, and then we want to create a portfolio of options to gain insights of the timing and impact of sourcing substitutes. So, a new thing that's coming out right now that's pretty hot is using artificial intelligence modeling and looking and designing new options to get the same form and function as before. There's a lot of AI design thinking tools that are being used in this area from a new product development perspective, and they're using it and they're shortening the NPI cycle time considerably by as much as 50 to 90% by using artificial intelligence. So that'll be certainly driving new substitutes and driving new functionality and form and fit. But we still will always have that. We still have the challenge of, the materials, the raw materials that are out there, and we have to continually look at contingency plans. So when you're building a product today, you may want to actually have 2 or 3 different ways to build that product. And if one does not work or you can't source that material, that you immediately have that new product option B sitting on the sidelines ready to go with that different raw material source. So that's what we are seeing now, more and more companies doing. So at the end of the day, the CTO and the supply chain officer need to work together more closely than they've worked ever before because of these changes. With that, I'll turn it over to Chris.
Hey, thanks, Jim. Yeah, so all that with all the case studies and everything and these examples, what we find is obviously relying on one supplier for all these critical materials can be disastrous. And so we've shown that you can reduce that risk by reducing your dependency on these key materials, obviously. But what we've shown in this, that was last webinar, what we've shown in this webinar is there's this additional competitive, unfair market share gain that you can get using Jim's words by shifting that dependence on that critical material sooner than your competitors and kind of beating them to the punch. So, this was able to play out, as Jim says, things that folks have kind of known innately but haven't been able to show. So these strategic structural simulations are really important for that. And what we've shown is that these kinds of things can be done with little or no actual data. You'll notice we just had 100 going through the, we didn't find out, was it 163 or was it 72? Didn't really matter. What we were showing was the behavior and the response of that system and how it reacts and adjusts and recovers based on something happening. And so that ends up being a little bit more important for some of these long-term strategic simulations. And so you can look at things with, you don't have to have all this mountain of data like you often do with network design type tools or some of these other risk management tools. All that data, you don't need that before you can actually start exploring options before that. Now, as you get data, that's great. Put it in there and you have better models. And these strategic risks play out over longer periods of time. If you look, network design tools will claim that they kind of, we can model out to, years or whatever, but there's not all these feedback mechanisms that show all these things happening and the suppliers adjusting and things like that. It's very set of what they're going to say happens in the next 2 years. So with this, you can actually you can find out how everyone in that system, that supply chain system, react and adjust and respond over time, over that long term. And in the end, no company is an island. So when you just look at your own company's operations, that's helpful, but let's call that micro or little supply chain management. The macro or the bigger is how this whole supply chain as a system acts and responds and recovers over time. And just because you order 100 from your supplier doesn't mean you get 100 from your supplier. They have to get 100 from their supplier, who has to get 100 from their supplier. And so that chain becomes really important. And what we've shown here in this industry, this tripling of orders, is that decisions and actions on one side of the chain can affect the other side of the chain, even when you don't do anything on this other side. So us as this defense OEM sat there, made no changes, and we're still impacted a year later with the tripling of orders. So it's really interesting when you see all these things play out.
So to summarize actions that you can take now, we've talked a lot about diversifying suppliers, building the reserves, just like a lot of folks did for the recent strike here. Invest in recycling and reuse. Obviously, we want to have more of that onshored and it's close to us and take advantage of that, especially for rare earth materials. And then the one that we really focused on today is promoting substitution and innovation, and really looking at innovation in a whole new light of innovation with supply chain in mind versus just innovation without that in mind. So these other areas are pretty much straightforward that we've covered in other webinars, but we just wanted to summarize them here for you so you have them all on one page. And we can always argue about which are most important for you and your company. Of course, there's a lot of regulations that are driving these decision making on the availability of raw materials within our country, within our friendly countries, and with countries that are friendly adversary countries. So it's going to be a wild time in the next few years, and because everybody really depends on everybody else. At the end of the day, our supply chains are interlocked, and we have relationships across the supply chain that are either going to be positive or negative, and that will drive a lot of decisions on how if we want the whole world to be healthy, or we only want us to be a healthy world. With that, we're going to get into how to get started. Chris?
Yeah, Greg had mentioned early on a supply chain readiness assessment. So that's always the first step, is just see how you are, see what your supply chain, kind of what your status is right now. in terms of maturity and capabilities. But what we showed here is mapping end to end. And when we say end to end, we mean top to bottom, OEM or whoever you are down further. And if you don't know where to start, a lot of times the supply chain very much mirrors the bill of materials. So if you know what you're building, there's going to be a supply chain that matches that. If I got a big thing made up of two little things, made up of four smaller things, you're going to see suppliers in those places. So at a starting point, again, without much data, you can just say, hey, let's assume the supply chain looks like the bill of material. So now you can, once you've got that, you can now look at risks and issues and do your what if scenarios and look at how disruptions impact, if there's changes in shipping or transport pathways, look at all those and how those play in. And now you've got this simulation from top to bottom of this supply chain. So you see how everyone acts and reacts and those rippling effects all the way through, which is great. And then finally, what you're sort of looking for is to have a set of scenarios with a set of responses or a playbook that says, well, when I see X, I'm going to do A, and when I see Y, I'm going to do B. And that's what we're trying to lay out right here is under certain, when you see these risks and these things beginning to occur, we already know what we're going to do and can plan to implement that. So we kind of have this playbook approach, which is very helpful.
Yep.
Now I'll let Greg take it over.
You bet. Thanks, Chris. Yeah, we'll just finish up with, folks, there are companies out there that are leveraging what we just described in our session today in new product introduction and development. We just thought we'd share 3 of them with you. Lockheed definitely introduces new components and systems to minimize their risk and to stabilize their production, especially for systems like the F-35. BAE, very good exemplar in supply chain risk and resiliency. They push constantly for collaboration and integration with their suppliers, especially when they talk about new technologies and getting them into production to scale up. And then Cisco's been around for a good long time. Everybody knows them. They are very, very good at supply chain risk and resiliency across all their product lines. They include collaboration across all their different supply chain nodes, because you remember, Cisco does not make anything. They do not manufacture anything. They are designed for manufacture, but they have 1,800 suppliers in their supply chain that actually assemble and build and test the product towards the finished good. So with that, the net, folks, is exemplar companies, and there are many out there, take a proactive approach to address the rare earth challenges. They do. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jim.
Thank you, Greg. And thank you, Chris, for putting together this series. This has been a great series of webinars on this, and I think what we ended up with was a very interesting case study on transforming risk events into opportunities. So today's webinar, we hope everybody got out what they expected out of this webinar. Please let us know. We're going to be starting a new webinar series either next month or next year. We're not quite sure yet, but we're going to take a little bit different approach. We wanted to give you the power of this tool on how you could see into your end-tier supply chain and make decisions. And I think what we want to focus on in the next set of webinars is more about making decisions. What are those types of risks, strategic decisions that you can make with Chris' powerful tool, and talk more about those types of situations than going detailed into the model scenarios. Now you can see the power of Chris's tool, which is unique, first of a kind. And we're looking forward to gaining your insights on what you would like to see. So please do let us know what we can do differently, and as we revamp and come up with a new series of webinars. Chris, your closing thoughts?
Yeah, this has just been, to me, a very fun series where we've built up in complexity, started with some easy risk issues, and then they got bigger and bigger and more complex. And I think it's just been fun seeing that a lot of the things that some of the exemplar companies and even some of the research that we've seen has been indicating, we've been able to prove and show in these simulations, but now quantifying it to be able to say, okay, conceptually, I understand there's this balancing point, but we're able to say, hey, in this situation, this is that balancing point, and able to specify. So I think we're getting answers that I think leaders haven't known it's been possible to get those kinds of answers, and so it's been real fun doing this.
Yep.
Greg?
You bet. Hope we provided you with some salient statistics and maybe a few helpful hints in terms of how to identify, assess, mitigate, and manage these strategic risks. They are strategic risks, folks. Some of these risks are what we call existential, which means many of these strategic risks, some companies will not be able to recover. So hopefully we provided some helpful hints, and we wish you all the best in your journey.
Thanks, Greg. And Chris, thank you very much. This has been a lot of fun putting this series together. And what I've learned out of the series is fantastic. I hope other folks have learned the power of your tool, Chris, and of course, Greg's years of experience of working with companies that are going through this. And as we said, there are companies that are capitalizing on this. This isn't necessarily brand new. They understand that where there's risk, there's opportunity, and they can help them grow. Where there's volatility, they grow. And those companies are the exemplar companies in the Fortune 10, 15 companies, and they continue to outpace their competitors and garner an unfair market share, quote, quote. And we hope that you learned a little bit here, something that you can take to the bank with your company and to grow your company further in the future. Thanks so much and have a great day.